I almost thought when I was studying and getting ready for this class, we're basically going to have this class and one more class, and then we're done for this semester. And I thought that we might jump into some of the evidence for God and talk about God's existence. But then I changed my mind and I thought there's still some foundational stuff that I want to get to you before we get to that. And that's what brought me to the conversation, evidence and argument, because I came across a couple different sources while I was researching that I thought were really good, and I really wanted to bring them to you. So we're going to talk about what is evidence, and we're going to talk about what is an argument, and what does that mean, what's a good argument to have, all these kind of things. So first, understanding different kinds of evidence. Before we can defend the Christian faith, we first need to understand what we mean by evidence. In our conversation throughout these weeks, we've thrown the word evidence around, and now we need to be clear about what we're talking about. Many people think that only scientific evidence counts. What we can test in the lab, what we can observe with our eyes and our senses, and what we can repeat. But when we talk about the truth of Christianity, we're often dealing with historical and philosophical evidence, not scientific or laboratory type evidence. Not everything has to be scientifically proven. So when we talk about evidence, we need to make sure we understand, and the people we're talking to understand, that when we are talking about evidence, it's not always just what's observable and repeatable and measurable and all these kind of things, the scientific method. There's different kinds of evidence. Think about how a jury examines a case in court. They can't go back and see the crime take place. They look at the evidence left behind and they make a reasonable decision. That's the same thing for any examination of a historical event, anything in the past. Now, I know in our culture today we have cameras and pictures and things like that. But even that can be fooled and falsified, so it's not 100% all the time, right? But you go back a decade or two or three, and or go back 100 years or 200 years, anything before the advent of photography, right? And we have historical books filled with events from history, both American history, world history, none of which we have pictures of, and yet we believe they really happened. Why? Because someone along the line was able to examine the historical evidence, and they know that this event happened, not because they were there, they didn't see it for themselves, but it's reasonable to believe it happened. Especially when the further back we go, ancient history. We talk about Hannibal coming over the mountains with elephants and that kind of thing, right? So that's how, even in modern day juries, that's how they decide whether or not someone killed someone or they committed a crime. It's about evidence. And that's what we do often when we study events like the resurrection of Jesus or the reliability of the Bible. So let's talk about the nature of evidence. Keep in mind, history cannot be proved or disproved. Okay, that's not the measurement. The measurement is not proving something, especially when it comes to history. You look at the evidence and you make a decision. The trustworthiness of any historical account is judged on the basis of evidence, not proof. And that's number one on your outline. The trustworthiness of any historical account, whether it was last week or 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago, the trustworthiness of any historical account is judged on the basis of evidence, not proof. So when we have conversations with someone who's a skeptic, who doesn't believe the Bible or whatever, and we start talking about Jesus, for instance, and we say, yeah, he was the Son of God and he rose from the dead, that's a historical event. Well, that supposedly happened 2,000 years ago. None of us were there. We don't have any pictures. There's no, so the only thing we can do is look at evidence. We can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead any more than we can prove God's existence. What we can do is we can present the preponderance of evidence so that someone can, for themselves, decide whether or not they choose to believe it. Does that make sense? You can only prove what is observable and repeatable. That's the scientific method. You can't observe the past. You can't repeat the past. So we ask, what is the evidence? And we base our decisions on that. Number two, this is important. Number two, when drawing conclusions about evidence, probability takes precedence over possibility. Probability takes precedence over possibility. Just because something is possible doesn't make it probable. Good reasoning looks for the most probable explanation given the facts. Here, this is an example. Suppose there's a car wreck between a big old car with steel bumpers versus a modern lightweight car. The lightweight car gets totaled, and the owner of the old car moves it out of the way of traffic. The police come and notice a dead possum in the road near the totaled car. This possum did all this, right? They're drawing the wrong conclusions from the evidence they see. Is it possible that it was some bionic possum that was super strong and whatever? Well, you and I would say that's absurd, but is it possible? Well, maybe. Are there other possibilities? How about this? Perhaps the owner of the big old car took a sledgehammer and beat the lightweight car. Or perhaps he put his car in reverse and repeatedly rammed the lightweight car. There are multiple possible explanations for the damage done. But in light of the evidence, what is the most probable explanation? Okay? Does that make sense? So we always think in terms of probability, not possibility. Yeah. Letter B. There are two main categories of evidence. You'll notice on your outline, this guy, J. Warner Wallace, he's got some great videos online. He's also written some books. He is a former homicide detective, sort of like Lee Strobel, who was a former investigative reporter. This guy was a former cold case homicide detective. And so what he's done is he's brought his expertise in examining evidence, historical evidence, and he's brought it to apologetics to help us understand what it really means. And so this kind of comes from this article I found that he wrote, but he's written a lot of stuff. So critics like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, we quoted Sam Harris last week, Richard Dawkins, that famous atheist, claim that Christianity is, quote, belief without evidence. However, this view misunderstands what evidence actually is. Detectives, lawyers, and historians use different types of evidence every day, and Christians do the same when evaluating the truth of Christianity. Now let's look at the two main categories as Wallace lays them out of evidence. Number one is called direct evidence. Direct evidence, which is basically just eyewitness testimony. This obviously in a court case is very valuable. When you can get somebody on a stand that says, I was there, I saw him do this, they love eyewitness accounts. Now, eyewitness accounts aren't infallible because somebody can lie, somebody can be coerced to lie, somebody can, sometimes their memories can be faulty and they think they saw something they didn't, whatever. So it's not without its faults, but it's direct evidence. I was there, I saw it happen, I'm giving my eyewitness testimony of what I saw, okay? The second is called indirect or circumstantial evidence. We've heard that before. If you've ever watched a cop show or you've ever watched a lawyer show, they talk a lot about circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is just that, it's indirect. It's evidence that points indirectly to a conclusion. Okay, for an example, seeing someone come inside with a wet raincoat, you infer that it's raining. But the truth is, there could be somebody sitting outside the doorway with a hose and hosing people as they walk in the building. That's possible. Is that probably what's happening? Most likely not, right? Unless we find other evidence to that. Judges help jurors understand the difference between these two forms of evidence. In California, judges provide the following instructions to jurors. Facts may be proved by direct or circumstantial evidence or by a combination of both. Direct evidence can prove a fact by itself. For example, if a witness testifies that he saw it raining outside before he came into the courthouse, that testimony is direct evidence that it was raining. Circumstantial evidence also may be called indirect evidence. Circumstantial evidence does not directly prove the fact to be decided, but is evidence of another fact or group of facts from which you may logically and reasonably conclude the truth of the fact in question. For example, if a witness testifies that he saw someone come inside wearing a raincoat covered with drops of water, that testimony is circumstantial evidence because it may support a conclusion that it's raining outside. Starting to understand the difference, right? The vast majority of cases tried in America are primarily circumstantial. So we've got direct evidence and indirect evidence. So, letter C, why both kinds of evidence matter? Why do we need both? Because, again, if you watch TV and you watch, police shows, and my wife and I love to watch cop shows, and you'll hear all the time, they disparage circumstantial evidence all the time. They're like, that's just circumstantial, you need to find direct evidence kind of thing. But what he writes, Wallace I'm talking about, he goes on to say that most of his cases are circumstantial, and he prefers circumstantial in abundance, meaning that circumstantial evidence, the facts that you find, can't be altered, unlike testimony. Testimony can be falsified, testimony can be, unwittingly incorrect or whatever. But when he finds evidence that is like a road map, it's like a map that points to a treasure kind of thing. He talks about that in his. So he says this, both types are considered equally valid in court. Okay, so courts take both. They prefer the direct or some kind of direct if they can get it. But when a murder takes place or something happens and nobody was around and there's no cameras and there's no whatever, then the only thing you got is circumstantial because nobody was there when it happened. And the truth is, most crimes, a lot of crimes happen in the dark alleys, no cameras, nobody's around for obvious reasons, right? Criminals don't want to get caught. Direct evidence can be false if a witness lies, while circumstantial evidence cannot intentionally deceive. The case for Christianity uses both types of evidence. An example of direct evidence would be the eyewitness accounts in the Gospels. So as the apostle or the disciples write Matthew and John, and then you have Peter helping Mark. It's assumed that Peter was Mark was a companion of Peter when he wrote the Gospel of Mark, and so it's widely accepted that the Gospel of Mark is Peter's account of what happened. So you've got Matthew, you've got Peter through Mark, you've got Luke, who was a separate person, wasn't one of the disciples, but did his own investigating. And then you have John, right? And so these gospel accounts are eyewitness testimony to what happened. And it talks about the eyewitness. In fact, Luke, when he talks about his research, he talks about things that people saw, and there's a lot of that kind of thing. Some indirect evidence that we would use, things like archaeology, early manuscript evidence, cultural references, and the writings of the early church fathers. These would all be examples of indirect or circumstantial evidence. Okay? Wallace, I gave this quote in your thing. He says this: when skeptics say we as Christians believe in something for which there is no supporting evidence, they simply betray their ignorance about the nature of evidence and the way in which detectives and prosecutors build cases. Like a detective's case file, the Christian worldview is built from many different lines of evidence that, taken together, point to the truth. Scientific evidence is helpful but not required. Most strong cases are built from testimonial and behavioral evidence. So, here's a question. Why do you think God allows faith to be based on evidence rather than absolute proof? Why do you think God allows faith to be based on evidence rather than absolute proof?
Well, one thing it could be that if there is absolute proof, you don't have to give any thought to it.
Okay?
Proof is just yes or no.
Yes.
It doesn't cause you to consider it with any thought of the detail and the background and come to your own position after exploring the evidence that's there.
Yes. So there's a journey. It takes effort. It takes thought. It takes faith, right? I mean, sometimes, and I've been in the same spot where you go, Lord, we're trying to see people drawn to you, to the gospel of Jesus, and, why don't you just write it in the sky in big letters so everybody can read it and go, I am real, I'm here, I want you, you know what I mean? The kind of the Daniel moment with the writing on the wall thing. You go, God, why don't you just do that? But the truth is, he chooses not to. He chooses faith to be based on evidence because of the journey. Because you have to want to know if and God wants us to want him. Does that make sense? What do you think, Clay?
That God wants us to seek him authentically. I think it's kind of bringing the two ideas together. It takes authenticity. Well, let's say it differently. If you're going to look at the evidence and then come to a conclusion that yes, there's a preponderance and I can believe that, there's the faith that would come from it that creates a more authentic faith. And it seems to me that that's what God would want for us in his relationship with us.
And that kind of answers this other question, right? What might that say about his desire for relationship and trust, right? If it was easy, everybody would do it kind of thing. And although God wants everyone, and he has written in the stars, and there's plenty of evidence, so it's not like he's keeping himself secret, but it's not as plain as you and I might go, God, how come you just don't show up or, whatever? Because I think the effort matters. I think he wants us to trust him. He wants us to put our faith in him. He wants to have a relationship with us. And so he doesn't make it super obvious. I mean, it's obvious, but you know what I mean.
Well, his desire for us is that he wants us to desire him.
Yeah.
I don't know why we question the absolute proof so much, though. Maybe I'm just ignorant scientifically, that's probably true. But when you say looking at the stars, I mean, just thinking deeply about the creation narrative, it's, I kind of run in my head this thing called analysis of competing hypotheses. And you just basically stack the evidence against a possible hypothesis, and you can let multiple hypotheses compete against each other, and it just makes no sense if there's anything other than God that created. There's just no logic behind, random creation. It just,
Yeah.
to me, it's near absolute proof that God exists and created. Just look at the human body and its amazing intricacies, that it all forms at the same time.
We're gonna watch a video.
DNA is just insane.
When we start talking about God, and Wallace did a video I watched today that I want to play for you guys, that talks about that kind of thing, and specifically about DNA.
Mhm.
And and one of the things he said in this talk that you'll see when I play it for you is that back in the 70s or 80s, 70s and 80s, there was the most renowned atheist, I can't remember his name, but he was the renowned guy. He's the guy who he debated all the Christian guys of the day and all that. I can't remember his name, but he was the guy. He was like the Richard Dawkins of the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
Anyways, when I think it was late 80s, early 90s, when the first DNA stuff started coming out and they began to talk about DNA and discover DNA, that literally flipped the script for him. And he actually wrote a book about how he wasn't an atheist anymore, and that was why. Because the profound information found in how DNA works and how it works in the body and all these things, that discoveries that were coming out, he said it's impossible to be an atheist anymore.
Yeah,
And so he became a Christian and so he wrote a book. You'll see the video. He talks about it. Okay. Whoops. Did my thing die? Oh,
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. So let's talk about argument for just a minute. Now, I found this thing from William Lane Craig. So William Lane Craig is a modern apologist, and he's written a lot of, if you remember a couple weeks back when we were talking about the kinds or the methods of apologetics, and we talked about classical and we talked about evidential and all these kind of things. You remember William Lane Craig was one of the names on there as an evidentialist or a classical apologist. I believe that's right. We go back and look, but he's a big name in apologetics and kind of has written a lot of books and articles and things like that. And so part of this comes from this 5 Arguments for God that he wrote. Okay? So now that we understand what evidence is, let's talk about what makes a good argument. An argument isn't a fight, it's a logical case for why something is true. That's what an argument is. It's a logical case for why something is true. So, what is an argument? What is an argument? Number 1, an argument is a series of statements or premises. We call it a premise, right? But that's just a statement. They're truth statements. An argument is a series of statements leading to a conclusion. An argument is a series of statements or premises that lead to a conclusion. William Craig explains that a sound argument must meet 2 conditions. 2 conditions. So number 2, a sound argument must meet two conditions. Two conditions. Letter A, it must be logically valid. Logically valid. The conclusion follows from the premises or the statements by following the rules of logic. Okay? So let me explain it this way. When we say an argument is logically valid, we mean this. If the premise or the statements are true, then the conclusion must also be true. In other words, the conclusion logically follows from the premises or statements. The structure of the argument is sound, even if the content, the actual statements, might not be. So, a statement, and this can be a little confusing, but a statement can be, an argument can be logically valid and be incorrect. Because when you think of this logic, think of it as structure. If it logically flows, even if the statements are false, if it flows logically, it's sound logically. It's still false because the statements were false, but it's still logically valid. In other words, the conclusion logically follows from the premises. The structure of the argument is sound. Let's look at an example. Okay, here's an example. Here's an example of a logically valid argument. Statement 1, all humans are mortal. Statement 2, Socrates is a human. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. That's valid. It follows logic. Here's a logically invalid. All dogs are mammals. All cats are mammals. Therefore, all cats are dogs. That's invalid. Okay? Because the conclusion, even though these statements are true, this conclusion is wrong. Just because they're mammals and they're mammals doesn't make them all the same. Okay? That makes sense? So, Craig says that a sound argument must have two conditions. One is it must have a sound argument is logically valid, and number two, that the premises are true. So in order to be a sound argument, it has to be logically valid, and the premises or the statements that it makes must be true. The premises accurately reflect reality. Okay, but here's the difference now. And he goes into it, and I'm getting into the weeds a little bit. But there's a difference between a sound argument and a good argument. A good argument goes one step further. The premises must also be justified. In other words, we must have good reason to think that the statements are true. So a good argument is both sound and justified. Sound meaning it's logically valid and has true premises. We talked about that. But it's also justified. Meaning that the premises, the statements given are believable and supported by evidence. So it's sound and justified. A good argument must also have justified premises, ones that are believable. This emphasis that an argument isn't automatically good just because it's sound. The premises must also have evidential support. The premises surely don't need to be known to be true with certainty, because we know almost nothing to be true with certainty. Perhaps we should say that for an argument to be a good one, the premises need to be probably true in light of the evidence. Another way of putting this is that a good argument is a sound argument in which the premises are more plausible in light of the evidence than their opposites. Do you understand what we're saying now? So if we go back, okay, we go back to our statements. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, right? But let's just say for a moment that we said that unicorns can fly. Horses look like unicorns, or, something where, it's a statement that could be true, I guess, somewhere. Unicorns exist, Bigfoot exists. Therefore, right? It's possible they exist, but is it probable? I mean, with the evidence available, are these statements true? That's what he's saying. He's saying it's not enough just to be sound. It has to also be a good argument. It has to be an argument where the truth statements are justified. Any questions about that? Thoughts? Sound and justified. Okay. Then the last part on this is we want to talk about probability and plausibility. In his writings, Craig uses the word plausibility, whereas before we had said that, it's about probability, not possibility. Remember that? So I wanted to bridge the gap a little bit and talk about probability and plausibility. In apologetics, we often argue that belief in God or the resurrection is more plausible and therefore more probable than the alternative explanations. A good argument is one in which the premises are more plausible than their opposites. Plausibility means something seems more likely to be true than false. Probability describes how likely something is to be true based on evidence. So the connection is that plausibility is our perception of probability. So in apologetics, we often argue that belief in God or the resurrection is more plausible. It's more likely to be true than not. When we start talking about God's existence, and we start talking about the resurrection of Jesus, or we start talking about the reliability of the scriptures and manuscripts, what we're saying is that these truths that we hold in our Christian worldview are more plausible, meaning that they're more likely to be true than false. Therefore, they are more probable. They're true based on evidence.